A lot of our movies, when you look at them, are based on very familiar designs. If you could arguably say Beauty and the Beast is like a moving children's book, or you could say Sleeping Beauty is moving medieval tapestries. At the beginning of Atlantis, we kind of said, what if it's a moving comic book? What if you actually could step into the pages of a comic book and feel the design and the angularity and the action and the graphic quality of a comic book, but feel it as a spectator, as someone that was strapped in alongside the explorers and could actually step into that world. And that's what the design world of Atlantis is. And I think Dave Getz and our art direction team on the film was at the forefront of trying to create a visual experience that makes you feel like you're sitting in the middle of an environment as opposed to watching an environment.
This movie was a little different than movies I've worked on in the past because rather than necessarily sticking from the visual development people that we had inside the studio, we actually hired freelancers from the outside who were working in the live action business. We call it look outside the gene pool. It's to get a group of people working on it who just bring a different design sense and something that we might not have seen before in the animation world.
And there were 4 gentlemen that did that as production designers in this film. Matt Codd, who had worked on films like Men in Black and some of the Jurassic Park films and others, came in and designed the Leviathan and the submarine. And Jim Martin, who's also known for a lot of his work in some of the most, the biggest special effects titles of the last decade, came in and helped us design elements of the submarine and the subpods and a lot of the vehicles. Ricardo Delgado, who's known primarily for his brilliant comic work and his work in film, helped us design a lot of the sets of Atlantis and the environments and the caves and the exotic world of the Atlanteans. And then lastly, Mike Mignola.
Well, Mike is a great comic book artist, and both Gary and I have been comic book fans from way back, and we kind of discovered his comics at around the same time, and really enjoyed reading them and love the artwork and love the stories.
He's done a number of comic books. The most famous or notorious is his Hellboy series, which Kirk and I are both huge fans of. We recognized the style early on as something that would fit in with the kind of thing we were doing.
So we're really drawn to Mike's work because of its very high contrast style, very bold use of black, and a kind of limited color palette. And that we were drawn to that. It just felt appropriate for the movie. And rather than just sort of take his comics as an inspiration, we decided to just go to the man himself and get Mike Mignola on the phone. Unfortunately, he was he was willing and able.
I can't get over the fact that these guys even knew who I was. And when I first came up here, there were these big boards set up. There were panels from whole pages from various comics I'd done, and notes all over them explaining how to draw like me. Mike Mignola does this, Mike Mignola does this. And the woman who did these things, I actually had to ask her what some of the notes meant. I didn't know how to draw like me, it's just the way I draw.
He came down and not only contributed a lot of great drawings that were the springboard for a lot of the big visual images in the story, but he also had a great story sense, being a writer and artist himself, and writing scores and scores of comic book stories. He just has a really, really fast and sharp creative mind, and came up with tons of ideas in the course of many story meetings. A lot of them found their way into the movie.
I'm used to doing a lot of talking. I'm not used to anybody listening. And I'm certainly not used to anybody listening to what I have to say and going off and making a movie out of it. So it's been pretty interesting.
When you look at the movie, and as the directors will tell you, a lot of what you're seeing are story ideas and concept ideas, like flying stonefish that shoot lightning bolts out of their mouth, or giant stone guardians that come up to save the day at the end of the film, that are right out of Mike Mignola's hand. And I think what was powerful about Mike, and certainly Matt and Ricardo and Jim, is their ability to create another world and be kind of visionaries for us in a visual sense. And then you take a guy like Dave Getz, whose job it is to pull all that together and all that kind of ingredients and bake a beautiful cake that the audience will want to eat. So it doesn't look like, here's a piece of chocolate and a piece of lemon meringue pie here and all these different flavors. He has to bake a cake that sits together and feels like one movie, and that's the genius of Dave Getz.
The main design theory for me kind of revolves around the opposition of these two cultures. So on the one hand, you have the intruding explorers in their clanking, smoke-spewing, noisy World War I era industrial, their philosophy is all reliant on technology, basically. And they're coming down, they're invading these Atlanteans who, their whole world is built around this mysticism or magic. And everything about them is really organic.
So we would have this organic magic kind of crystal-based technology versus this world of pre-World War I. And you can look at books and you can look at photos and you go on the internet for things like that, but really, for something like that, nothing really beats being like right next to the objects.
The interiors of the submarine were based on 2 trips, not only to a harbor in Los Angeles, but to a harbor in Baltimore to look at old period submarines.
And we actually got to go into the submarine and kind of crawl through it and imagine what that would be like to be in an environment that enclosed.
Cramped is the word that comes immediately to mind. Now, you're talking about very compact, men and machinery. It's more like a big wad of machinery that has a little hole bored through it that, that men may pass through and barely cohabitate in. I mean, it's truly amazing. And, I can imagine being underwater for weeks in one of those things.
We also had the good fortune to travel to Maryland, to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, because it's like the nation's largest collection of armored vehicles, going all the way back to World War I.
We were able to crawl into these tanks and look through their gun sights and kick the doors and slam the tires.
It was the crudeness and the absurdity of the technology, and yet the complete faith in the technology that made it a really interesting time period. I think the only era that could take place in was 1914, and these field trips help us immerse ourselves in that era.
It was like rich material for us to like just, okay, we can
pull a bit from here, pull a bit from there, and kind of synthesize that into the design of the explorer's technology.
It was earthy, it was gritty, it was pre-war, it was all of those things, as opposed to Atlantis, which was watery, it was more ethereal, it was a cooler environment, it was warmer, it was rounder, it had a very different feel than above land. Obviously there's no place to go such as that for Atlantis because it's a very made-up world. However, what we did do was create the umbilical cord from above land to Atlantis, which was the caverns and the caves. So we did some work with the Carlsbad Cavern folks who very graciously took us and showed us some of the more interesting environments in the caves, and some of them were quite hairy.
Okay, kids, don't try this at home. Go down this hole in the ground out here in the middle of nowhere.
There was one cave we went into, it was called Spider Cave, and as we all kind of shimmied our way down into it, and gee, why is it called Spider Cave? The guy says, just look above you.
First thing you do is you look up, and the place is covered with spiders and bugs. It's like a scene out of a Spielberg movie. And I'm not bothered by spiders and bugs, but when they're about 3 inches from your head and there's a lot of them and they're big and they look like they're hungry,
You don't want to touch anything. Stay as low to the ground as you can.
Those trips, aside from a bonding experience where we take our crew out and throw them together in a cave 800 feet under the ground, creates a certain esprit de corps between your filmmakers. It also creates a real sense of the topic that you're facing. We're pursuing life deep in the center of the earth, and it's fascinated science fiction writers for centuries. The idea of exploration in a world that we've never known that's right beneath our feet. And that was something that was so apparent when you get down there and you find out, well, the big room at Carlsbad Caverns is 13 football fields across. That's huge. And that makes you start to believe that you can sustain a whole civilization underground that's based on the elements that you have available underground, like the warmth from lava or the water dripping from the ceiling, and create an ecosystem that's completely different than our own, but that exists completely for the servicing of Atlantis and that culture underground.
One of the things that happened right away in the creation of this movie that Kirk and Gary wanted was that Atlantis not look like the expectation you had. And I think most people in their heads have kind of a Greco-Roman view of Atlantis.
The kind of cliche version of Atlantis.
The 1950s Atlantis, the aquarium toy look.
Yeah, the aquarium toy look. It's like crumbled Greek columns underwater. That's not what we wanted. We wanted something that would give our Atlantis, its own identity.
In fact, in the style guide, there's a little picture of a Greek temple with a cross crossed out. It's just not where we're going with this. We looked at Mayan architecture, styles of kind of ancient, unusual architecture from around the world, and the directors really liked the look of Southeast Asian architecture. And if you think of Angkor Wat in Cambodia as kind of generally The idea, the model, you have these kind of beehive-shaped towers. There's a very kind of particular characteristic to the stuff. That became the basis for, you know, our physical appearance of Atlantis.
There was the idea that Atlantis was kind of the cradle civilization or the mother civilization, and that other styles, whether they were South American pyramids or the temples of India or even, you know, the more Western stuff like the Greek and Roman architecture, all kind of branched out of this.
So if you take and deconstruct architecture from around the world into one architectural vocabulary, that's what our Atlantis looks like. You might think, why not go out and grab a camera and film an expedition to Atlantis, and you'd have the movie. Why mess with all this design and kind of taking the audience through with these beautiful design frames and scenes? And I would argue, well, that's what animation's about. You can start with a blank piece of paper and not only take an audience on a journey to Atlantis, but pull their eye around the screen and make them feel things with color and shape and texture. With a pencil and a piece of paper and a paintbrush, you can create a world that is fantastic and you've never experienced before.